fog didn't so much settle over the mountains as it simply was. A great, gray, woolly beast that had lain down across the peaks millennia ago and decided never to get up. It swallowed sound and distance and perspective, reducing the world to a damp, intimate circle of now. Elias Warren's rental car, a sad little economy thing that smelled of stale fries and regret, had coughed its way up the final switchback and into this muffled realm an hour ago. Now, standing before the cabin, he felt the silence press in on his eardrums like a physical force, a sensation not unlike the pressure change before a storm, but without the promise of release. The cabin itself was a squat, stubborn thing of dark, weather-stained timber and a moss-furred stone chimney. It looked less built and more grown, a fungal extrusion from the damp earth. The key, obtained from a taciturn man at a gas station 3 valleys back, turned in the lock with a sound like a bone breaking. The door swung inward on groaning hinges, revealing a single room dominated by a silence so profound it felt curated. Dust motes, stirred by the intrusion, danced in the slanted, gray light filtering through a single grimy window. They moved like tiny, confused galaxies, swirling in the aftermath of his Big Bang entrance. Home sweet home, he thought, and the irony was so dry it threatened to spontaneously combust. He dropped his duffel bag on the rough-hewn floorboards. The thud was obscenely loud, a violation of the quiet. This was it, the great escape. From the city's incessant electronic shriek, from the fluorescent-lit loneliness of his apartment, from the sheer, overwhelming muchness of it all. He had traded the symphony of sirens and shouting for this damp, woolen silence. Fair trade, he assured himself. A logical one. He needed quiet to hear himself think. Though now that he had it, he wasn't entirely sure what he was supposed to be listening for. His entire life fit into 2 duffel bags and a reinforced equipment case. The case he handled with the reverence of a priest transporting a relic. He set it on a sturdy wooden table near the fireplace, flicking the latches with a practiced flick of his thumb. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, lay his children, a vintage Hallicrafter's communications receiver, a modern ICOM transceiver, a tangle of specialized cables, a notebook bound in scuffed black leather, and 3 pens, black, blue, red. Order, precision, tools to make sense of the noise, both literal and metaphorical. The sight of them, neat and obedient in their beds, calmed the faint, skittering anxiety at the base of his skull. This was a language he understood. World of signals and static, of patterns emerging from chaos. A solvable world. He spent the next hour in the methodical, meditative ritual of setup. The run of coaxial cable out to the pine tree he'd spotted, the careful connection of the power supply, the gentle warming hum of the vacuum tubes in the Hallicrafters coming to life. The dials glowed a soft, orange amber in the gathering gloom of the cabin. It was a beautiful, warm, technological light. A little piece of the rational world, humming quietly in the heart of the primeval fog. He ran a finger over the frequency knob, a gesture as comforting as a rosary. There, he thought, anchored. A trip into the village for supplies was a necessity he'd been dreading. Cinder Glen wasn't so much a town as a brief, apologetic clearing in the trees. General store that also served as a post office, a clapboard building that might have been a town hall or a very large shed, and a handful of houses clinging to the mountainside like lichen on a rock. The air was cold and carried the clean, sharp scent of pine and the underlying musk of decaying leaves. His footsteps on the gravel road were the only punctuation in the long, run-on sentence of the afternoon. The bell above the general store door jangled with a startling, metallic cheerfulness. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of cured meat, coffee, and old wood. A man with a face like a weathered walnut and eyes the color of flint looked up from behind the counter, his gaze lingering on Elias just a moment too long. Not with hostility, exactly. More like the way a geologist might study a new and unfamiliar type of rock. Elias bought coffee, canned soup, bread, and batteries. Setting up for a long stay, then? The man asked, his voice a dry rasp, like leaves skittering across stone. Something like that, Elias said, offering a smile that felt tight on his face. Needed some quiet. The man grunted, a noncommittal sound that seemed to convey a vast and weary understanding. Quiet we got. Fog's good for that. He bagged the items with slow, deliberate movements. You're up at the old Ackerley place. It wasn't a question. Elias felt a peculiar chill, unrelated to the temperature. The man's knowledge felt expansive. That's right, HMPH. The man handed over the bag. His fingers, gnarled and thick, brushed against Elias. They were surprisingly cold. Mind the radio waves up there. Stories say the fog listens. He said it without a hint of humor, his flinty eyes utterly serious. Elias, internal skeptic, a well-exercised muscle, immediately flexed. Rural superstition. The kind of thing isolated communities cook up to explain whether patterns they don't understand. Keep that in mind, he said, his tone carefully neutral, a shield of polite rationality. Back at the cabin, as the deep indigo of night bled into the sky, staining the perpetual gray of the fog, Elias lit a kerosene lamp. The orange glow pushed back the shadows, but not very far. They pooled in the corners, thick and liquid. He made a simple dinner on the small propane stove, the ritual of it, opening the can, heating the contents, feeling both profoundly lonely and strangely comforting. This was control. This was order. A can of soup heated, a radio tuned, a problem solved. He sat at the table, notebook open, and began to tune the Hallicrafters. The speaker came alive with the sound of the universe, a rushing, hissing white noise, the cosmic background radiation of a million distant signals, all blurred into a soothing, impersonal roar. It was the sound of nothing and everything. He let it wash over him, a sonic blanket. Through the window, the world had vanished. There was only the black glass of the night and the faint, damp reflection of his own pale face, superimposed over the void. A man in a tiny room of light, surrounded by an ocean of silent, listening fog. He tapped his fingers on the tabletop, a nervous, staccato rhythm that perfectly matched the pulse of the static. There must be a pattern to everything, he thought, the words a familiar mantra. Even here, especially here, it was the reason he'd come, to find the signal in the noise. The thought was a small, warm ember in the vast, cool darkness. He clung to it. Outside, something, a branch, surely, scraped softly against the side of the cabin. He stopped tapping, listened. There was only the static and the sound of his own breathing. He forced his fingers to be still and wrote the first entry in his notebook. Day 1. Established base. Atmosphere. Quiet. The needle on the Hallicrafter's dial glowed like a malevolent ember in the absolute black of the cabin, a precise, unwavering point of orange light in a sea of static. Elias' head jerked up from the cradle of his arms, a sharp pain lancing through his neck. He'd fallen asleep at the table again. The notebook was stuck to his cheek, a patch of drool blurring the precise, blocky letters of Day 1. Established base. Atmosphere. Quiet. kerosene lamp had guttered out, leaving the room in a darkness so complete it felt like a physical substance packed into the corners, a velvet oblivion. Only the soft, oceanic hiss of the radio speaker filled the void. 3:17 a.m., his internal clock, always precise even in unconsciousness, supplied the number. The witching hour passed and gone, the hour of nothing. He rubbed his eyes, the grit under his lids feeling like powdered glass. This was the price of solitude, of silence. It left too much room for the mind to echo. He was about to shut the set off, to stumble toward the narrow cot and its promise of blank, dreamless sleep when the static changed. It wasn't a dramatic shift. It was a subtle thinning, a coalescence, like cream swirling into black coffee. The white noise softened, receded, and in its place emerged a sound that was not a sound, but the ghost of one. A voice, distant and frayed, as if transmitted through 1,000 miles of corroded copper wire. Elias froze, his hand hovering over the power switch. His heart, a sluggish thing a moment before, gave a single, hard thump against his ribs. Atmospheric bounce, his brain supplied instantly, the engineer in him seizing the most logical lifeline. A skip signal from a ham operator in Saskatchewan, or a trucker on I-80, a ghost signal. But the voice didn't have the cheerful, tinny banter of a trucker. It was low, frantic, a desperate monotone that clawed at the edges of the static. Can't see my hand in front of my face. It's not right, it's thick, like wool, wet wool. I can hear them, whispering, just on the edge of it. They're not words, it's like rustling paper, no leaves, dry leaves. A cold finger, entirely separate from the cabin's chill, traced a path down Elias' spine. His professional curiosity ignited, a bright, clean flame that burned away the last vestiges of sleep. This was no trucker. This was something else. A drama, a prank. He leaned forward, his nose almost touching the warm glass of the dial, and with a touch as delicate as a safecracker's, he adjusted the fine-tuning knob. The voice sharpened, crystallized. It was a man's voice, middle-aged, laced with a terror so pure it was almost chemical. The light's gone. The flashlight just died. It didn't flicker. It was just gone, like something swallowed it. I'm calling out, but my voice doesn't carry. It just falls at my feet. I think I'm walking in circles. Trees all look the same. Pale. Everything is pale. Elias' fingers, moving with a will of their own, scrabbled for the recorder he kept velcroed to the side of the Hallicrafters. He punched the record button. The red lit a tiny, accusing eye in the dark. The spools of the microcassette inside began to turn with a soft, purposeful whir. Document the anomaly. It was his first, second, and third instinct. Preserve the data. Analyze later. I can see little lights now, like will-o'-the-wisps. But they're not moving right. They're waiting. They're arranged. A pattern, I think they're eyes. The man's breath hitched, a wet, ragged sound. Oh God, they're coming closer. I can see them between the trees, small, pale. They're just standing there, watching. Why are they just? The transmission didn't end with a scream. It didn't fade out. It was severed. One moment the voice was there, choked with a horror so visceral Elias could almost smell the man's sweat. The next, a deafening blast of pure, undiluted static screeched from the speaker, so loud and sudden that Elias flinched back, his chair legs scraping against the floorboards like a cry of protest. Then, just as abruptly, it was gone. The radio returned to its soothing, mindless ocean roar. Silence. Thick. Heavy. Elias sat there for a full minute, his own breathing the only sound in the universe. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his sternum. He reached out a hand that trembled only slightly, and hit rewind on the recorder. The whirring sounded obscenely loud. He played it back. There it was, the voice, the terror, the abrupt, surgical cutoff. He listened to it 3 more times, each pass layering the man's desperation onto the fabric of the cabin's silence, until the very air felt stained with it. A hoax, he thought, forcing the idea into his mind like a key into a stubborn lock. It has to be. Some local with a transmitter and a sick sense of humor, broadcasting ghost stories for the one idiot who just moved into the spooky cabin on the hill. The logic was sound, plausible, almost certain. But the voice, raw, unvarnished fear in it. It didn't sound acted. It sounded recorded. It sounded real. The gray light of dawn was seeping through the window, turning the cabin's interior a watery, washed-out gray. The magic hour was over. The world was insistently, boringly normal again. He needed coffee. He needed to think. The incident needed to be logged. He opened his notebook to a fresh page, his pen poised. Log entry, 03:33 hours. Intercepted anomalous VLF transmission. Male voice approx. 40-50 years age. High stress indicators. Content describes disorientation in a dense, light-absorbing medium, visual phenomena described as lights and small, pale observers. Transmission terminated abruptly with high-amplitude broadband static. Hypothesis: localized prank broadcast and our psychological audio projection experiment. Requires further monitoring. He underlined hypothesis 3 times. The word looked solid, reassuring. Bulwark against the lingering, irrational chill that still clung to him. He made coffee on the propane stove, the ritual of it, the click of the igniter, the gurgle of the water, a grounding anchor in the normal world. The hot, bitter liquid scalded his tongue, a welcome, painful reminder of reality. Later that day, he went back into Cinder Glen, the microcassette recorder a heavy weight in his jacket pocket. The village was just as quiet, just as still. The same man was behind the counter of the general store, polishing a glass with a rag that looked less than clean. Back so soon? The man asked, his flinty eyes missing nothing. Just need a few more things, Elias said, placing a box of batteries on the counter. He hesitated, the words feeling foolish in his mouth before he even said them. I picked up a strange broadcast last night. On the radio, sounded like a man lost in the woods, talking about lights and children. He watched the man's face closely. There was no dramatic startlement, no widening of the eyes. Instead, a subtle shudder seemed to come down behind the man's gaze. His polishing slowed. That right sounded pretty convincing. Almost like I don't know, a distress call. Elias pushed, feeling like he was probing a tooth with his tongue. The man set the glass down with a definitive click. Lots of strange noises in these mountains. Wind in the pines sounds like talking sometimes. Fog plays tricks on the ears. He looked past Elias, out the window at the perpetual gray. Best not to listen too hard to the tricks. Folks around here, they know better than to go wandering when the fog gets a certain way. Some who did, well, they're not around to talk about it. It wasn't a direct answer. It was a stone wall dressed up as folksy wisdom. A warning, wrapped in enigma, dipped in superstition. Elias felt a flare of frustration. This was exactly the kind of non-information that drove him mad. Hints, whispers, ominous vagaries. Right, Elias said, his voice tighter than he intended. Tricks, sure. He took his batteries and left. The walk back to the cabin felt longer, the fog denser. The man's words echoed in his head, mixing with the recorded voice on the tape. Disappearances. Best not to listen. The time he reached his door, The analytical part of his brain had reasserted itself, smothering the unease with a blanket of cold logic. A prank, amplified by local legend and his own isolation. A feedback loop of suggestion and fear. That was all. He would set up a more sophisticated recording apparatus tonight. He would analyze the spectral signature of the transmission. He would find the pattern, the source, the explanation. He was an engineer, a man of reason. He dealt in signals and noise, not in ghosts and stories. But as he keyed the cabin door open, a single, clear thought intruded, unwelcome and sharp as a splinter. The voice on the tape hadn't said anything about fog. It had said the darkness was thick, like wet wool. He had just assumed. He stepped inside, closing the door firmly on the gathering gray. The coffee, he decided, hadn't been nearly strong enough. He'd make another pot. A stronger one. The kind that could strip paint and keep irrational thoughts at bay for at least a few more hours. The human mind is a magnificent, desperate pattern-matching machine, a relentless engine of correlation that would rather find a false positive than accept a true negative. It would rather see a face in the moon than stare into a meaningless void. Elias Warren's mind, honed on circuit diagrams and signal harmonics, was a particularly obsessive example of the breed. It was a tool, and like any good tool, it sought a purpose. Now, it had found one. His cabin had transformed from a refuge into a command center for a one-man war against the inexplicable. The walls, once bare, were now papered with large-scale topographic maps of the Cinder Glen area, each one a spiderweb of precise, hand-drawn notations in red, blue, and black ink. Lines radiated from his cabin like spokes on a wheel, marking signal strength estimations. Circles denoted areas of anomalous atmospheric disturbance, logged from his nightly vigils. Coffee table was no longer for coffee. It was a burial mound for technical manuals, schematics, and a precarious cigarette of empty mugs that smelled of despair and stale Arabica. His sleep schedule had become a theoretical concept, a ghost of a routine haunting the edges of his waking hours. He existed in a perpetual, jittery twilight, fueled by caffeine and a gnawing, intellectual itch that had burrowed deep into his cortex. The broadcast, was no longer a singular event. It was a recurrence, a phenomenon, nightly now, like clockwork, or more accurately, like a broken record of damnation skipping on the turntable of reality. 3:33 a.m., the numbers glowed on his digital recorder's display with a mocking numerical symmetry. It was never 3:32. It was never 3:34. It was always 3:33. A trivial coincidence, he told himself. A glitch in his perception. A self-fulfilling prophecy of anticipation. Yet his pen would freeze above the notebook precisely at 3:32, his entire body tensing like a bowstring, waiting for the release. And it would come. The static would thin. A new voice would emerge from the electronic murk. A woman's voice, breathy and young, describing the feeling of cold fingers brushing her neck in the fog. An older man, his voice gravelly with a lifetime of smoke, cursing as his compass spun in useless, dizzying circles. A child, singing a fragmented, discordant nursery rhyme that ended in a soft, wet gurgle. The details varied. The core did not. Disorientation. An enveloping, sensory-depriving medium, they never called it fog, he noted. That was always his interpolation, the appearance of small, pale observers. And the sign-off. The same 5 words every time from a different voice, in a different tone. Sometimes a whisper, sometimes a shriek, sometimes a flat, resigned statement of fact. The children are waiting. Then the screech of static. Then silence. He had them all on tape now, a growing library of terror. He'd labeled each microcassette with clinical precision. VLF anomaly 01 male 40s, VLF anomaly 04 female 20s. He'd tried to analyze them, of course. He'd run spectral analysis on his laptop, the waveforms blooming on the screen in cascades of green light. They showed nothing unusual, just human speech patterns, then a sharp spike into the ultrasonic range, then nothing. The silence afterward was the most technically perfect silence he had ever recorded, a total absence of signal that was, in its own way, more unnatural than the voices. He'd become a ghost in the town himself, a pale, nervous specter who would materialize in the general store to buy more batteries or coffee or canned beans, his eyes darting, his conversations a strained pantomime of normalcy. Man behind the counter, whose name Elias had learned was Bill, would watch him with that same infuriating, granite-like patience. "Getting any good programs on that radio of yours?" Bill asked one afternoon, his tone deceptively light as he rang up a dozen AA batteries. Elias' head snapped up. "Programs? Sure, music, ball games, the weather." Bill's eyes were unreadable. "Lots of noise out there. Easy to get tuned into the wrong frequency." It was a warning. It was always a warning with these people, wrapped in folksy metaphor and delivered with the casual certainty of a law of physics. Don't listen. Don't ask. Look down at your shoes, and maybe the scary thing will pass you by. "I'm just monitoring atmospheric conditions," Elias said, the lie tasting like tin on his tongue. "For a project. HMPH. Bill bagged the batteries. Atmosphere's plenty conditional around here. Doesn't need more monitoring. It just is." Another day, desperate for a different data point, Elias tried the diner. It was a sad, fluorescent-lit affair with sticky vinyl booths and a smell of old grease that had seeped into the very walls. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Dottie, poured him coffee without asking. "Quiet around here," Elias ventured, stirring a pointless amount of sugar into the murky liquid. "Yep," Dottie said, wiping the counter with a cloth that merely redistributed the grease. "I suppose everyone minds their own business." Her eyes flicked up to him, and in them he saw a flicker of something, not suspicion, but a deep, weary pity. "Business around here is best kept to oneself. Less messy that way. You're the fella up at the Ackerley place, ain't ya?" He nodded. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping. Old man Ackerley. He was a listener, too. Had himself a right fancy radio set up. Always scribbling in notebooks. She shook her head, a slow, pendulum sweep of regret. Then he wasn't, just wasn't. Fog took his dog first, then it came for him. Elias' blood went cold, a precedent, a data point. What do you mean took? But the shutters came down. The moment passed. She straightened up, the pity in her eyes hardening into a defensive wall. "Just means he's gone. Coffee's on the house." She walked away, ending the conversation as definitively as the static screech ended the broadcasts. Back in the cabin, Elias stood before his wall of maps, a red marker in his hand. He'd added a new notation, a CKERLY M prior observer. Status, deceased missing. The rational part of his brain, the part that was screaming to be heard over the rising tide of panic, offered alternatives. The man was old. He'd had a heart attack. He'd wandered off with dementia. The dog ran away. Correlation is not causation, but the pattern. The goddamn pattern. He played the tapes again, one after another. A symphony of fear conducted by an unseen hand. Different voices, same story, same ending. The children are waiting. It was a loop, a recording. It had to be. Some sick, local tradition of broadcasting horror stories to scare newcomers. That was the only logical explanation. It was a prank. A very elaborate, very consistent, very unfunny prank. He said it out loud to the empty cabin, his voice sounding thin and reedy against the oppressive silence. It's a prank, a hoax, a pattern of localized psychological manipulation. The words echoed off the wooden walls and died. They sounded hollow, meaningless, a spell recited to ward off a monster that was already in the room. He looked at the radio, its dials dark. He looked at the maps, his frantic notations looking less like data and more like the mad scribblings of a prisoner marking days on a cell wall. The silence in the cabin was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was listening, and it was waiting for 3:33. He picked up his notebook, his hand trembling only slightly. He didn't write another hypothesis. Instead, he wrote a single, stark sentence, underlining it until the pen nearly tore through the paper. The pattern is the message. The coffee tasted of ashes and failure. Elias set the mug down, the ceramic clicking against the wooden table with a sound that was too loud, too final in the pre-dawn hush. He'd spent the night chasing phantoms in the static, and the phantoms had won. Again. His eyes felt like they'd been scoured with sand, his brain a overheated processor stuck in a recursive loop of analysis and doubt. The pattern is the message, he'd written. A grand, dramatic statement. And what had it gotten him? Headache and a profound sense of intellectual bankruptcy. He needed air. Real air, not the stale, recycled atmosphere of the cabin that now smelled of sweat, anxiety, and soldering iron. He needed to see the sun, if the sun ever bothered to punch through the perpetual gray blanket suffocating Cinder Glen. He shoved his feet into his boots, not bothering to lace them, and stumbled outside. The world was different. The fog had changed. It was no longer a distant, woolly beast lounging on the peaks. It had descended. It filled the clearing around his cabin, a dense, luminous gray that swallowed sound and reduced visibility to a mere 20 feet. The trees at the edge of the property were mere suggestions, dark, blurred strokes in a watercolor painting of gloom. The air was cold and wet against his face, carrying a scent that was oddly metallic, like ozone after a lightning strike, but without the cleansing promise of rain. It was the smell of something old and still and waiting. His rational mind, ever the diligent accountant, began cataloging the phenomenon. Advection fog, valley fog, moisture content high, temperature drop significant overnight. The words were empty calories, doing nothing to nourish his growing unease. This felt intentional, oppressive. It felt like being inside a lung waiting for the exhale. Driven by a need to confirm the world still existed beyond his tiny circle of clarity, he trudged toward the gravel road that led into town. His unlaced boots scuffed and slipped on the stones, each clumsy step an affront to the profound silence. The fog pressed in, a tangible presence. It beaded on his jacket, dampened his hair, and filled his mouth with a flat, tasteless moisture. He reached the road and turned left, toward the dim, ghostly outlines of Cinder Glen's main street. His plan to walk until the fog thinned, to prove to himself it was just weather, to find a newspaper or a person who wasn't a repository of cryptic warnings, felt suddenly childish and absurd. He was a man walking into a bowl of milk. That's when he saw it. A flicker of motion at the very edge of his vision, down where the road dissolved into the gray. He stopped, his heart giving a single, hard knock against his ribs. He turned his head slowly, his neck muscles tight. Nothing. just the swirling, mindless dance of the fog. Sleep deprivation, he thought, the mantra as comforting as a worn stone. Optical illusion, pareidolia, the brain seeking patterns in random noise. He took another step. There, again, a shift in the gray, not a tree, not an animal, a vertical shape, small, pale. It was there for a fraction of a second, a stark, white smudge against the darker gray of the forest behind it, and then it was gone, reabsorbed into the mist. Elias stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. The silence was absolute. He could hear the blood pulsing in his ears, a frantic, biological rhythm at odds with the static world around him. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, his boots crunching on the gravel with a deafening lack of subtlety. He saw another one, or perhaps the same one, 50 feet ahead, just off the side of the road, standing between two dripping pine trees. A child. It was small, slight, dressed in something pale and indistinct. Its back was to him. It was perfectly, utterly still. "Hey," Elias called out, his voice swallowed by the fog, emerging as a weak, strained croak. "Hey, kid, are you lost?" The figure did not move. It didn't turn. It didn't acknowledge him in any way. It was a statue. A mannequin placed in the woods by a profoundly unfunny prankster. It's a local kid, his brain chattered, scrambling for the lifeline of normalcy. Playing a game. They're wary of strangers. They're wearing a costume. For a school play. A very bleak, very minimalist school play. He took another step, then another. His breathing was shallow, rapid. The figure remained motionless. He was close enough now to see more detail, the way the damp air clung to it, giving it a soft, fuzzy outline. It seemed almost to glow with a faint, internal luminescence, a will-o'-the-wisp made of bone and cloth. He was 20 feet away. 15. He could see the back of its head. The hair, if it was hair, was light, almost white, plastered damply to its scalp. "It's okay," he said, his voice softer now, a coaxing tone he didn't recognize as his own. "I'm not going to hurt you. Are you from the village?" He took the final few steps, his hand half raised, a gesture meant to be reassuring. The fog swirled around his legs. He reached the spot where the figure stood. There was nothing there. He blinked. He turned a full, slow circle, his boots squelching in the wet pine needles. Nothing. The space between the two trees was empty. The ground showed no footprints, no sign that anyone had been standing there. It was just empty. A cold that had nothing to do with the temperature seized the base of his spine. He spun around, looking back down the road toward his cabin. The fog had closed in behind him. He was in a tiny, gray bubble of reality. And in that bubble, he saw another. This one was closer, on the other side of the road, facing him. Its face was a pale, blank oval, no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, undifferentiated skin the color of old milk. It was the absence of a face, and it was more terrifying than any grotesque mask could ever be. It simply stood there, facing him, a silent sentinel in the mist. Elias' breath hitched. A soundless scream built in his chest, a pressure with no release. He took an involuntary step backward, his heel catching on a stone. He stumbled, arms flailing, and landed hard on his backside in the wet gravel. The impact jarred his teeth. He scrambled backward like a crab, his heart hammering against his sternum, his eyes locked on the spot where the thing had been. It was gone. He was alone on the road, sitting in a puddle, his pants soaked through, his heart trying to punch its way out of his chest. The fog swirled, indifferent. Had it ever been there? The silence screamed at him. His rational mind, battered and bleeding, made one last, desperate stand. Hypnagogic hallucination, sensory deprivation, extreme fatigue. You fell, you hit your head, you imagined it. But he hadn't hit his head. He'd just fallen. And the image was burned onto his retina. That smooth, featureless face, that small, patient body. It wasn't like the frantic, terrified voices on the radio. This was calm, serene, malevolent in its perfect stillness. The children are waiting. The phrase echoed in his head, not in a voice from the radio, but in his own internal monologue. It was no longer a cryptic punchline to a ghost story. It was a description, a statement of fact. He pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling, his clothes clinging to him coldly. He didn't run. Running felt like an admission, a confirmation of the terror that was curdling in his gut. He walked stiffly back toward the cabin, his head on a swivel, his eyes straining against the gray. He saw no more figures, but the feeling of being watched was a physical weight between his shoulder blades, 1,000 invisible eyes tracking his every clumsy step. He finally reached the cabin door, fumbling with the key, his fingers numb and stupid. He fell inside, slamming the door shut and leaning against it, his chest heaving. Familiar space, once his sanctuary of logic and order, felt alien, violated. The maps on the wall were no longer charts of data. They were maps of a hunting ground. The radio was no longer a tool of inquiry. It was an oracle of doom. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. He balled them into fists, but the tremor remained, a tiny, constant vibration of fear. He had come to Cinder Glen to find patterns in the noise. He had found one. It was a pattern of small, pale shapes in the fog, of silent, watching things that vanished when confronted. It was a pattern that led, inexorably, to a single, terrifying conclusion. He was no longer just listening to the story. He was in it. Maps were no longer maps. They were living things, and they were bleeding. Elias red ink notations, VLF anomaly 03, figment apparitionis TLOC, had metastasized from tidy symbols into frantic, spider-like clusters, each one a record of a sleepless night, a voice from the void, a pale watcher in the mist. They were no longer hypotheses. They were symptoms, and he was sick with them. He could no longer pretend. Rational fortress he'd built around his mind was under siege, and the walls were crumbling. The prank theory was a joke, a pathetic little shield against something that had the cold, hard weight of truth. He needed data of a different kind. He needed context. He needed to know what the hell was happening in this godforsaken bowl of fog, and the only people who might know were the ones who had been silently watching him lose his mind from behind their drawn curtains. He marched into Cinder Glen with a purpose that felt brittle, like glass stretched too thin. He bypassed the general store and its infuriatingly stoic proprietor, Bill. He didn't need batteries. He needed answers. The town, what little there was of it, seemed to hunch under the low sky, its windows like downcast eyes. He'd heard a name, dropped once by the waitress Dottie with that same weary pity, Marin Kettle. The locals say, the keeper of the inconvenient truths everyone else preferred to ignore. He found her house on the outskirts, a place that looked less built and more coaxed from the landscape itself. It was low and sturdy, with a stone foundation that seemed to grow out of the ground. A walking stick was propped by the door, and a lantern, unlit, hung from a hook. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. He knocked, the sound swallowed by the fog. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then the door creaked open a few inches, revealing a sliver of a face, weathered skin, sharp gray eyes under a silver-streaked brow, a gaze that didn't just see him, but seemed to inventory the wear on his soul. Yes, her voice was like the sound of two stones grinding together, dry, cautious, and holding immense geological patience. Miss Kettle, my name is Elias Warren. I'm staying up at the Ackerley place. He swallowed, his throat dry. I was hoping I could talk to you for a moment. Those flinty eyes didn't waver. Talk's cheap, and often costly. What about the fog, the things in it? The words sounded insane, even to him. The radio broadcasts, a long pause. He could feel her weighing him, measuring his desperation, his fear, his capacity for causing trouble. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of centuries, she opened the door wider. Come in then, but wipe your feet. I don't need the outside world tracked all over my floors. Inside, the house was a museum of a life lived in one place. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling. Shelves were crammed with jars of unidentifiable contents, and a fire crackled in a stone hearth, pushing back against the damp chill. She didn't offer him a seat, so he stood awkwardly near the fire, his hands shoved in his pockets. I've been listening, he began, his voice too loud in the quiet room. On my radio, at night, I've been hearing voices, people. They're lost. They're scared. They talk about children, pale children, in the fog, and then I think I saw them on the road. Marin Kettle moved to her fireplace, poking at a log with an iron. Sparks flew up the chimney. The fog remembers, she said, not looking at him. Remembers what? Elias' voice cracked with frustration. What does that mean? People keep saying things like that. The fog remembers. Don't listen too hard. Best not to wander. What are you all not telling me? She turned then, her gaze level. We're telling you to leave well enough alone. Some doors, once opened, don't close so easy. You think you're the first curious soul to come up here with your gadgets and your questions. Old man Ackerley had his notebooks. There was a fella before him with cameras and meters. A woman before that, studying local folklore. She said the last word with a distaste that curled her lip. They're all gone. The fog took their curiosity and gave them silence in return. Took them where? Elias pressed, stepping closer. What is it? It's not a what, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing him to lean in. It's a when. It's always been here, this valley, this town. It's a fold in the cloth, a place where things slip through or get caught. She gestured with the poker toward the window and the oppressive gray beyond. Those children you hear about, them you think you see, they're not alive. Not like you and me. They're not ghosts, neither. They're echoes, collectors. They're from all the times this has happened before. They're the ones who didn't make it out, and now they're part of the lure. They gather, they wait. And when the fog gets a certain thickness, when the conditions are right, they call. And someone new always answers. Elias felt the room tilt. Her words weren't the vague superstitions he'd expected. They were a specific, horrifying cosmology, a theory of the phenomenon. It was insane. It was impossible. The voices on the radio, he breathed, are the ones who answered, she finished, her voice grim. Past, maybe future, time's a river, but here in the glen, it's a swamp. Things sink and don't always stay down. Their voices get caught in the static, replaying. A warning nobody heeds until it's their own voice they're hearing. A cold certainty settled over him. He thought of his notebooks, his maps. I need to see the records, the missing persons. There must be reports. Bitter, dry smile touched her lips. The sheriff's office over in Millerville has a file, a thick one. Hikers, campers who strayed, suicides. Easy answers for a world that don't want hard questions. You won't find your answers in an official report. You'll find them in the silence between the lines. It was all he needed, a direction, a thread to pull. He left her house with her warnings ringing in his ears, a counterpoint to the frantic beating of his own heart. He drove the winding road to Millerville, the county seat, a slightly larger town that felt 1,000 miles away from the suffocating atmosphere of Cinder Glen. The clerk in the records department was a bored-looking woman with cat-eye glasses. Elias made up a story about genealogical research, about a long-lost uncle who might have vacationed in the area and vanished. She directed him to a microfiche machine and a cabinet of dusty rolls of film. Spent hours there, the greenish glow of the screen bleaching his face, the whir and click of the machine a monotonous soundtrack to his descent into horror. He started with recent years, then went back. 5 years, 10, 20. The reports were exactly as Marin had said, dry, bureaucratic, and utterly dismissive. Subject failed to return from hiking trip. Presumed animal attack or fall. Search suspended. Subject left note indicating despondency. Vehicle found at trailhead. No body recovered. Over and over. The dates, the names, the dry legal phrasing blurred together into a grim liturgy of disappearance. Then he found it. A name, Carl Brinkley. Reported missing 4 years ago. His wife stated he'd gone hiking near Cinder Glen and never returned. The description matched, a man in his 40s. Elias' hands were trembling so badly he could barely thread the microfiche. He found the evidence locker log for the case. Personal effects recovered from his vehicle. Item 4. 1 portable VHF transceiver make Yaesu model. FD60R radio. He'd had a radio. Elias fumbled in his jacket pocket for his digital recorder, his fingers numb. He scrolled through the saved files, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found it. VLF Anomaly 01 male 40s. He hit play, lowering the volume and pressing the device to his ear. The frantic, terrified voice filled his head. Can't see my hand in front of my face. It's not right. It's thick like wool. Wet wool, he looked back at the microfiche screen. At the name, Carl Brinkley. The voice on the tape was describing the last moments of a man declared dead 4 years ago. The air left his lungs in a rush. He slumped back in the hard wooden chair, the recorder falling from his nerveless fingers onto the table with a clatter. The bored clerk looked up, annoyed. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a hoax. It was a recording. A replay. Ghost in the machine, yes, but a ghost with a name, a date, a case file. Marin was right. The fog remembered, and it was broadcasting its memories on a frequency only the damned could hear. He gathered his things, his movements slow and robotic. He walked out of the records building into the fading afternoon light of a normal town, and he felt like an imposter, a refugee from a nightmare carrying a contagion of dread. He had his correlation. He had his proof. The pattern wasn't just a message. It was an obituary, played on a loop forever. And he was now part of the audience, waiting for the next performance, dread coiling in his gut like a cold, living thing, waiting to see if he'd recognize the next voice. Or worse, waiting for the terrible, inevitable day when he wouldn't need to check the records at all. The problem with discovering a pattern is that you can't undiscover it. It becomes a lens, warping everything you see, and the view through this particular lens was a flat-out nightmare. Elias Warren was no longer an investigator. He was a patient in a contagious asylum, and the disease was the truth. The cabin walls, papered with the names and dates of the dead and missing, felt less like a research center, and more like a tomb he was decorating for his own eventual interment. He'd stopped sleeping entirely. Sleep was a vulnerability, a blank space in his vigilance where the fog could creep in, not just under the door, but into his mind. He existed on a diet of caffeine, canned soup, and a low-grade, humming terror that vibrated in his teeth. The radio was both his oracle and his torturer. He dreaded 3:33 a.m. with the fervor of a man awaiting a scheduled execution. Yet he was compelled to be there, notebook open, pen poised, a chronicler of his own mounting insanity. The fog had become a permanent fixture, a fifth element. It pressed against the cabin windows like a curious, blind animal. He'd taken to sketching its movements, its densities, the way it swirled against the glass, as if looking for a way in. His sketches were frantic, chaotic things, less scientific notation, and more the scrawls of a prisoner trying to map the walls of his cell. Lines of his topographic maps began to blur, overtaken by these new, insane patterns that looked like storm systems of the soul. He needed to talk to someone. Not Bill, with his granite-faced warnings. Not Dottie, with her pity. He needed Marin Kettle. She had seen his evidence, heard his theory, and hadn't laughed. She had, in her own cryptic way, confirmed it. She was the only rock in this shifting, gray world that didn't seem likely to dissolve into mist. He found her on her daily walk, a silhouette against the wall of fog at the edge of the tree line, her walking stick tapping a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the silence. She looked like a figure from a fairy tale, the kind that offered gifts that were also curses. "Miss Kettle," he called out, his voice raspy from disuse. She stopped, but didn't turn right away. She finished her observation of the fog, a long, slow scrutiny, then turned those flinty eyes on him. "Warren, you're still here." It wasn't a question. It was an assessment of damage. "I can't leave," he said, and it was the truest thing he'd said in weeks. "Not until I understand." "Understanding won't save you," she said flatly, resuming her slow walk along the perimeter. He fell into step beside her, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the damp. "It just makes the trap more interesting to look at before it snaps shut. The man I found in the records, Carl Brinkley." His voice was on my tape, from 4 years ago. The words tumbled out of him. "It's real, it's all real, you were right." She nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the ground ahead. "The past isn't dead here, it isn't even past, it's just layered like silt in a riverbed. Sometimes the current stirs it up. But why?" The question was a plea. "What's the point? Why lure people? Why the children? Why the broadcasts? It can't just be random malevolence. There has to be a reason." His engineer's mind, even now, sought a function, a design spec for the horror. Marin stopped walking and looked at him, a deep, weary sadness in her eyes. "You're asking a hurricane why it blows. You're asking a wolf why it hunts. There's no why. There just is. This place is hungry. It feeds on attention, on curiosity, on fear. It's a machine, and we're the fuel. The children are the bait. The voices are the song it sings to itself." She tapped her stick lightly on the wet earth. Tap. Tap. "The only thing to do is not listen, not look, not feed it. But I have listened." He cried, the frustration boiling over. "I have looked. What do I do now?" Her expression softened, but it wasn't comforting. It was the look of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. You wait. You see if it's tasted enough of you to let you go. Or you see what it does next. She turned and walked back toward her house, leaving him standing there at the edge of the world, the fog swirling around his ankles like a cold, eager pet. That night, the waiting ended. He was at his post, the orange glow of the dials the only light in the cabin. 3:32 a.m. his heart began its familiar, frantic drum solo against his ribs. He clutched the pen, his knuckles white. The static hissed, a sound that had become as familiar and hated as his own breathing. 3:33. The static thinned, but the voice that emerged wasn't the frantic terror of Carl Brinkley, or the breathy fear of the young woman, or the gurgling song of the child. It was a voice he knew. It was measured, gravelly, cautious, It was Marin Kettle's voice, but the tone was all wrong. The calm, weary certainty was gone, replaced by a breathless, ragged fear that made his blood freeze in his veins. Too late, should have left, should have told him to go. But the knowing, it's a poison. It wants the knowing. A wet, rattling cough. It's in the house, not outside, inside, in the walls. I can hear them, scratching in the chimney, like little fingers. Elias sat bolt upright, his chair screeching backward. No, this wasn't happening. This was a past recording, a future one. His mind short-circuited, unable to process the temporal paradox of a living woman's voice describing her own. There at the window, their faces, blank, just smooth, waiting. They don't have to come in. The fog does. It's coming under the door, like smoke, cold smoke. Her voice broke, a sob of pure, undiluted terror. It's in my throat. I can't breathe it out. It's filling me. It's so cold. Tell someone the pattern. It's not a pattern, the sentence was never finished. It was replaced by a sound Elias had never heard before, a soft, internal, suffocating gasp, followed by the most profound silence he had ever encountered. Then, the familiar, brutal shriek of static. It ended. Elias was on his feet, his entire body trembling violently. He stared at the radio as if it had grown fangs. The digital recorder's red light was still on, a single, accusing eye. He had just heard Marin Kettle die. He had heard the fog kill her. This wasn't the past. This wasn't some anonymous victim. This was a woman he had spoken to hours ago. This was the future, his future. The broadcasts weren't just replays. They were previews. The inevitability of it crashed down on him, a physical weight that drove him to his knees. There was no escape. There was no solving it. It was a train on a track, and he was tied to the rails, and he just heard the whistle of the engine that was coming for him, and for the one person who had dared to speak to him. He scrambled to the window, wiping a clear spot on the fogged-up glass. The fog outside had thickened, grown more substantial. It wasn't just lying against the cabin. It was nuzzling it, embracing it. He could see tendrils of it, like gray, seeking roots, creeping across the clearing toward his door. He backed away from the window, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He looked at his maps, his notebooks, his radios. His beautiful, logical tools. They were useless. They were toys in the face of this. He was no longer just in the story. The story was writing him. And the next chapter, he knew with a cold, sick certainty, was already recorded. He just hadn't heard it yet. But he would. At 3:33 a.m., and the voice that spoke it would be one he recognized. The world had shrunk to the dimensions of a coffin lined with static. Elias Warren's existence was now a single, relentless, screaming note of fear, sustained day after day, night after endless night. The cabin was no longer a place. It was a state of being, a siege mentality made of wood and desperation. He had boarded up the windows, not with planks. That would have required a trip to a hardware store he could no longer face, but with his own maps and charts, taping them over the glass in a frantic, papery barricade against the outside. It was a pathetic gesture, like trying to stop a flood with a tissue, but the alternative was to see the gray and what moved within it. He couldn't stop the sounds, though. The fog had a sound now, a soft, wet, susurrating sigh as it flowed against the walls of the cabin, a constant reminder that he was submerged, that the air itself had turned against him. And the scratching, it was faint, intermittent, at the door, at the window frames, a dry, delicate sound, like twigs being dragged across the wood, or the skittering of impossibly light feet on the porch roof above his head. He would freeze, his breath held, his heart a trapped bird beating against his ribs, and the sound would stop. Always stopping the moment he focused on it, leaving only the mocking, breathy sigh of the fog. His radio equipment was silent. He had unplugged it all, yanking the cords from the walls in a spasm of terror after the broadcast of Marin's voice. The silence in the cabin was even worse than the static had been. It was a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. His mind rushed to fill it. He was mapping the fog. It was the last, desperate twitch of his analytical mind, a doomed attempt to impose order on the chaos. He had no instruments for this, no way to measure its density, its temperature, its particulate matter. So he invented his own units, the Elias scale of opacity, the Warren index of tactile malevolence. He would peer through the tiny gaps in his papered-up windows and assign values. 900 hours, density 8. 5. E-visual penetration, 3 meters. Auditory dampening, severe. Observed motion, swirling counterclockwise, suggestive of large, lazy predator. He wrote it all down in his notebook, his handwriting becoming progressively more spidery, unhinged. He was cracking. He knew it. The knowledge was a cold stone in his gut. The man who had arrived in Cinder Glen, who believed in signals and noise, was being systematically dismantled. The foundation had been pulled out, and he was in freefall, clutching at the absurd, trying to make data out of nightmare. The food was running out. The coffee was gone. This presented a problem of terrifying proportions. The door. He would have to open the door. He spent 3 hours working up to it, standing a foot away, staring at the knob as if it were wired to a bomb, which, in a way, it was. He'd piled every piece of movable furniture, the rickety table, his chair, the empty equipment cases, against it. A sad little fortification. Finally, driven by a thirst that felt like it was cracking the lining of his throat, he moved it all, piece by piece, his ears straining for the scratching, the sighing. He unlocked the door. He pulled it open a bare 2 inches, just enough to peer out. The fog was right there. It didn't wait politely on the porch, it pressed itself into the opening, a cold, damp tongue probing into his sanctuary. The metallic ozone smell flooded in, making his eyes water. And through the gap, he saw them. They were standing in a semicircle at the edge of the clearing. 5 of them. 6. Their pale forms were clearer now, more defined, as if the fog was concentrating itself into their shapes. They were just standing, watching the cabin, watching the door. Their faces were still smooth, blank ovals, but they were tilted at identical slight angles, a uniformity that was more chilling than any grotesque expression could ever be. He slammed the door shut, his body shaking so violently he could barely get the lock turned. He didn't bother moving the furniture back. What was the point? The barricade was for keeping things out. They were already in the air, in his head. The darkness inside the boarded cabin was absolute, a solid thing. He fumbled for a candle, lit it. The tiny flame threw monstrous, leaping shadows against the papered walls, making his own maps seem to writhe and contort. He sat on the floor, his back against the door, the candle between his knees. He was whispering to himself, a continuous, low stream of consciousness. Okay. Density increased with proximity to door. Confirms gaseous permeation theory. The subjects, the apparitions, demonstrate group coordination, suggesting a hive intelligence or a shared directive. The scratching could be a form of echolocation, mapping the interior through vibration. Or it could just be scratching. He laughed then, a short, sharp, barking sound that scared him more than the silence had. He sounded like a madman. He was a madman. He was conducting a scientific study of his own damnation. The candle flame guttered. There was no draft. The room was sealed. Yet the flame bent, wavered, and nearly went out before flaring up again. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, a cold that seeped up from the floorboards and bit through his clothes. Then, from the radio speaker across the room, the one that was unplugged, its power cord coiled on the floor like a dead snake, a voice emerged. It wasn't a broadcast from the ether. It was a whisper, soft, intimate, and impossibly clear, as if the speaker were right next to his ear. Elias. It was a child's voice, light, almost sing-song, devoid of any emotion whatsoever. He jerked, his head cracking against the door. The candle toppled, sputtering out on the floorboards, plunging him into utter blackness. "We're cold, Elias." Another voice from his left. "You're so warm inside," from his right. "Let us listen with you," from directly above him. He clapped his hands over his ears, squeezing his eyes shut, rocking back and forth. "No, no, no, you're not real. You're VLF phantoms. Auditory hallucinations. You're not real." A soft, dry chuckle seemed to come from inside his own skull. "We're real enough." Then the scratching began again. But not outside. Inside. Inside the walls. A soft, insistent scrabbling, moving from one end of the cabin to the other, behind the maps taped to the windows. It was in the chimney, a dry rustling like a nest of enormous insects. It was under the floorboards, a slow, dragging sound. He curled into a ball on the floor, his hands still pressed to his ears, but the sounds weren't in the air anymore. They were in the structure. They were in the bones of the building. They were in his bones. The siege was over. The walls had been breached. The enemy wasn't at the gates. The enemy was in the throne room, and the king was huddled on the floor, weeping in the dark, his kingdom reduced to the few square feet of freezing floorboards beneath him. His grand project of analysis, finally, completely, and utterly bankrupt. He had tried to map the fog, and the fog had mapped him instead, finding all the weak points, the empty spaces, the deep, terrified places where it could take root and grow. He didn't know how long he lay there. Time had become as meaningless as his Elias scale of opacity. Eventually, the scratching stopped. The whispering ceased. The cold abated by a degree. A sliver of gray light, the pathetic, filtered light of a fog-bound day, seeped through a gap in his paper barricade. He uncurled. He was stiff, freezing, parched. He crawled to his notebook, which lay open on the floor. He picked up his pen. His hand was steady. The frantic energy was gone, burned away, leaving behind a cold, clear, and absolute certainty. He didn't write about density or auditory dampening. He wrote a single line, the final entry in the log of his sanity. Resistance is a variable the system has already accounted for. Silence in the cabin was a held breath, a vacuum waiting to be filled. Elias had not slept. He could not. Sleep was the antechamber to the nightmare, and he was already in the main event. He sat on the floor, his back against the cold wood of the door, surrounded by the pathetic ruins of his barricade. The maps taped over the windows were not just paper, they were the pages of a doomed manifesto. He had stopped writing in the notebook. The pen felt like a betrayal in his hand, a tool for a language that had proven useless. He was waiting, not with the anxious anticipation of before, but with the hollow, metallic certainty of a condemned man listening for the footsteps of the guard. He knew the time. He didn't need a clock. His body had become an instrument of exquisite, terrible sensitivity, tuned to the frequency of his own demise. Every cell in his body knew it was 3:32 a.m. His mouth was dust dry. His bladder was a painful, tight knot, but he didn't move. Moving was an action with purpose, and all purpose had been leached from the world. There was only the waiting. 3:33. The sound did not come from the unplugged radio. It did not whisper from the walls. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, a vibration that started in the floorboards and traveled up his spine, into his teeth, settling behind his eyes. It was the sound of a universe tuning itself to a single, awful station. And then his own voice spoke. It was his, undeniably. The soft-spoken, deliberate tone, the slight nasal quality, the undercurrent of nervousness he'd always hated. But it was flattened, stripped of any real emotion, like a recording played back on damaged equipment. Log entry. If anyone finds this, the date is irrelevant. The time is now. A pause, filled with the sound of ragged, echoed breathing. I can see the lights again, through the gaps in the boards. They're not will-o'-the-wisps. Not eyes, they're anchors, points of focus. They're where the pattern wants me to look. Elias' hands flew to his own throat, his fingers pressing against his larynx. His mouth was not moving. The voice was coming from inside his own head, a parasite of sound, wearing his vocal cords as a disguise. The scratching has stopped. They know I'm listening. They know I've heard the broadcast, my broadcast. The inevitability is a physical law here, like gravity. You can't argue with gravity. You can only fall. A cold, dry sob escaped Elias' lips, a real sound in the real world, horrifically out of sync with the calm narrative horror unfolding in his mind. The door is the only variable left, the only choice, to wait for it to come in or to go out. The broadcast, my voice. It says I go out. It says I follow the lights. It says I step into the fog. A final act of data collection. A horrible, distorted chuckle echoed in the psychic space. The ultimate field study. The voice stopped. The vibration ceased. The cabin was silent again. For a full minute, Elias did not move. He was a statue of terror. The analysis was over. The data was in. The hypothesis was proven. He was a closed loop, a pre-recorded message. The voice had not described a past event. It had narrated a future one. His future one. It had laid out the only remaining path with the cold, dispassionate logic of a software program executing its final line of code. You can only fall. Panic, pure and electric, finally broke the paralysis. It was not a strategic fear, not the cautious anxiety that had plagued him for weeks. This was the animal, the primal thing in the core of his brain that knew it was in a trap and would now chew its own leg off to get out. He scrambled to his feet, a wordless cry tearing from his throat. He lunged for the radio equipment, for the beautiful, logical machines that had been the instruments of his damnation. He didn't unplug them this time. He picked up the Hallicrafters, its tubes still warm, its dials dark, and with a strength he didn't know he possessed, he hurled it against the stone fireplace. The crash was spectacular. Glass shattered, metal shrieked and bent. Components exploded across the room in a shower of plastic and wire. The sound was a glorious, violent rejection of it all. He grabbed the ICOM transceiver next, smashing it against the floor again and again, until it was a lump of useless junk. He tore the maps from the windows, the tape ripping long strips of paper, revealing the solid, indifferent gray of the fog outside. He swept the notebooks and pens from the table, a blizzard of failed logic. He was screaming, raw, incoherent sounds of rage and terror. He was breaking the laboratory. He was destroying the evidence. If he could just smash it all, erase it all, maybe he could unmake the truth. Maybe he could unrecord the broadcast. He collapsed to his knees amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving, his hands bleeding from cuts he didn't remember getting. The silence rushed back in, deeper now, punctuated by the faint tink-tink of cooling glass from the fireplace. The fog pressed against the now bare windows, a patient observer. It was done. His rebellion was over. It had lasted 3 minutes, and it had changed nothing. The voice had already accounted for it. The voice had known he would do this. The voice had probably included it in a part of the broadcast he hadn't even heard yet. The panic drained away, leaving behind a vacuum of such profound hopelessness that it felt like a physical emptiness in his chest. He was so tired. The fear was exhausting. The resistance was exhausting. The sheer intellectual effort of trying to decode the indecipherable had burned through his last reserves. He crawled away from the wreckage, away from the door, and curled into a tight ball in the farthest, darkest corner of the cabin. He pulled his knees to his chest and wrapped his arms around his head, making himself small. A child hiding from a monster. But the monster wasn't under the bed. It was in the air. It was in time itself. He wasn't trying to keep it out anymore. He was just trying to make the target smaller. Outside, the fog continued to press. It was no longer just at the windows. It was seeping under the door, a slow, silent tide of gray, tendrils creeping across the floorboards toward him, smelling of ozone and ancient, still water. He watched it come, too exhausted to even shudder. The thought was clear, cold, and final. There is no out. There was only the narrative, the one he had already recorded, the one waiting for him. He closed his eyes. He didn't pray. He didn't curse. He just made a single, quiet promise to himself, a tiny act of defiance in a war he had already lost. When the time came, he would not go quietly. He would not follow the lights. He would make them drag him. He would be a variable the system hadn't fully accounted for, a statistical anomaly. It was a pathetic hope, a tiny, guttering candle in an ocean of fog. But it was all he had left. He held on to it in the dark as the cold mist touched his skin. Memory surfaced from the depths, unbidden and perfect in its clarity. A single, pristine bubble of before rising through the black oil of his current existence. He was 8 years old. His father, a man of few words and fewer affections, had taken him camping in a state forest far from Chicago. Elias had gotten lost, just for an hour, wandering off the path after an interesting beetle. But in that hour, the world had transformed. The friendly trees became towering, menacing strangers. The chirping of birds turned into mocking laughter. The sun-dappled floor became a confusing maze. He remembered the moment the panic had crested, a cold wave about to crash over him. And then he'd seen it, a flash of his father's red flannel shirt through the trees. Not a sound, just a color, a beacon. The relief that washed through him was so profound, it felt like a physical warmth. He'd run toward that flash of red, sobbing, and found his father calmly whittling a stick by the trail, never having known his son was gone. Now, 40 years later, Elias Warren understood the other side of that memory, understood that not every light in the darkness is a rescue. Some are lures. He wasn't hiding in the corner anymore. The paralysis had passed, burned away by a final, desperate kind of curiosity. If this was the last data point he would ever collect, he would collect it with his eyes open. He stood at the window, watching the fog. It had changed again. It was no longer a formless wall. It had structure. It pulsed with a soft, internal luminescence, like a vast, gray jellyfish resting over the world. And within it, the lights. They were there. Not the pale, watching figures, but the lights they sometimes held, or were, or manifested. Small, shimmering points of gold and silver, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern at the edge of the tree line. They wove in and out of the trunks, a silent, ethereal dance. They were the most beautiful things he had ever seen, and he knew, with a certainty that felt engraved on his bones, that they were for him. This was the invitation, the final sign. The pattern was not just a message or an obituary. It was a script, and this was his cue to enter stage left. His earlier vow to make them drag him seemed like the posturing of a different man, a man who still believed he had leverage in a negotiation. There was no negotiation. There was only the aesthetic completion of the pattern. To resist now would be inelegant, illogical even, a flawed variable introduced at the final moment. He was an engineer. He appreciated a clean execution. A strange calm settled over him. The fear was still there, a cold stone in his gut, but it was distant, observational. He was watching himself from a great height. He found his jacket, shrugged it on. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. He did not look back at the wreckage of his radios, the torn maps. That was the workshop. This was the field test. His hand on the doorknob was steady. The cold brass was a shock against his skin, a last point of anchor in the real world. He turned it. The door swung inward silently. The fog did not rush in. It was just there, as if the cabin had always been submerged in it, and he was only now noticing. The air was shockingly cold, and so thick with moisture, it felt like breathing through a wet wool blanket, a sensation he now understood all too well. The smell was the same metallic ozone, but stronger, purer. It was the smell of nothing, of a place where life had never been. The lights still danced at the tree line. They seemed brighter now, more focused. They were waiting for him to commit. He took a step across the threshold, then another. His boots made no sound on the sodden ground. The fog closed around him, warm compared to the cabin's chill, a strangely intimate embrace. It clung to him, beating on his jacket, his eyelashes, his lips. He could see maybe 5 feet in any direction. The cabin vanished behind him, swallowed by the gray after just 3 steps. There was no world anymore. There was only this bubble of mist and the lights ahead. He followed. The lights retreated as he advanced, maintaining their distance, always just at the edge of visibility. They led him away from the road, away from the town, deeper into the woods. The familiar path he'd hiked in his first days was gone. The trees were different here, older, twisted, their bark pale and slick with moisture. They looked like the ribs of some enormous, long-dead beast. He heard it then, faint at first, then clearer. It was the radio static, but it wasn't coming from a speaker. It was in the air itself, a soft, hissing undertone to the silence, like the sound of the universe between stations. And woven within it, a voice, his voice, taking the first steps now. The fog is not cold, not anymore. It's neutral, a medium. The lights are maintaining a constant distance. Hypothesis. They are markers, not sources. They are indicating a path of least resistance through the voice faded in and out with the swirls of mist, a ghostly narration of his own actions. He wasn't hearing it with his ears. He was feeling it, a vibration in his teeth, a pressure behind his eyes. His own personal broadcast, the documentary of his dissolution, narrated in real time. He kept walking. The ground beneath his feet became softer, marshier. The trees thinned, then disappeared altogether. He was in a clearing he had never seen on any map, a wide, flat expanse of sucking, black mud and reeds. Fog was thinner here, the lights brighter, coalescing into a tighter group ahead of him. And then he saw the children. They were not hiding. They were not flickering at the edge of his vision. They were arranged in a semicircle, standing perfectly still in the bog, waiting for him. Dozens of them. Their small, pale forms were the source of the light, a soft, phosphorescent glow that emanated from their skin, illuminating the tendrils of fog that wreathed them. Their faces were still smooth, blank, but they were all turned toward him, waiting. He stopped at the edge of the solid ground. This was it, the destination, the end of the path. The static in the air grew louder, hissing and popping. His narrated voice became more frantic, yet still clung to its analytical tone. Subjects are visible, dozens. Emission of light is confirmed as biological in origin, or perhaps transdimensional, classification impossible. They are not hostile. They are expectant. The air temperature is dropping rapidly. Perception is becoming difficult. One of the figures, slightly in front of the others, raised a pale, glowing hand. It was not a threatening gesture. It was an invitation, a summons. Elias looked back the way he had come. There was nothing there, just a wall of gray. There was no cabin, no road, no life. There was only forward, into the circle, into the story. Last of his resistance, that tiny, guttering candle of defiance, finally went out. There was no fear anymore. There was only a vast, weary acceptance. He had followed the pattern to its logical conclusion. He had deciphered the code. The code was himself. He took a final, shuddering breath of air that was still halfway real. Then he stepped off the firm ground and into the black, sucking mud of the clearing. It was like stepping off the edge of the world. Mud pulled at his boots, cold and hungry. He did not struggle. He walked forward toward the waiting children, toward the light, his movements slow and dreamlike. The fog closed in behind him, sealing the path. The children did not move. They just watched him come, their blank faces offering no comfort, no malice, no anything. They were just the end of the equation. He was halfway to them when the static reached a deafening crescendo, a roaring white noise that filled his entire skull. His own voice was lost in it. The world dissolved into a blinding, silent white. And then, nothing. The last thing Elias Warren ever truly knew was the profound, absolute certainty that his father would not be waiting for him on the other side of the trees. Whiteout was not an absence. It was a plenum, a filling. It was like being plunged into a vat of pure, uncut silence and static, a substance that rushed into his eyes, his ears, his nose, his mouth, forcing out the last vestiges of the air he had known. Elias did not drown. There was nothing to drown in. There was only the transition, a violent, silent shifting of realities, as if the universe had snapped into a new configuration with him at its center. When the white receded, it did not reveal the world he had left. The black bog, the pale children, the twisted trees, all were gone. He was standing in a featureless plain of gray. There was no ground beneath his feet, yet he was standing. There was no sky above, yet there was light, a sourceless, shadowless, twilight glow that came from everywhere and nowhere. The fog was everything. It was the air, the substance, the medium, and the message. It was a world without edges, without coordinates, without up or down. His first conscious thought was a frantic, internal scream for orientation. Latitude, longitude, altitude, bearing. The words were empty, meaningless sounds in his mind, like a forgotten language. His internal compass spun in nauseating circles. There were no landmarks. There was only the same eternal gray in every direction, a perfect sphere of nothingness with himself at the dead center. Anik, the old, familiar friend, tried to rise, but it was different here. It had no purchase. It was like trying to scream in a vacuum. The emotion formed a tight ball of terror in his chest, but it could not propagate. It simply dissipated, absorbed by the infinite, hungry gray. He was terrified, but the terror was a theoretical concept, a memory of an emotion he could no longer fully feel. He tried to move. His legs obeyed, but there was no sensation of walking. No muscle strain, no resistance from the ground that wasn't there. He was gliding, a phantom in a phantom world. He looked down at his hands. They looked the same. Pale, long-fingered, the nails bitten. But when he turned them over, he saw the fog moving through them. Not around them, through them. He was becoming translucent, a sketch of a man drawn on mist. That's when he saw them again. The children. They were all around him. He had not approached. They had simply manifested from the gray. Their faint, phosphorescent glow, the only points of reference in the void. They stood in a wide, perfect circle, enclosing him. Dozens of them. Hundreds, perhaps, the circle receding into the fog to infinity. They were closer now. He could see the fine, almost imperceptible texture of their blank faces, like polished alabaster. They were not looking at him. They were just facing him. Their silence was absolute, a pressure more intense than any sound. He opened his mouth to speak, to shout, to demand answers from this silent jury. No sound came out. His voice was gone, not hoarse, not stolen, gone, as if he had never possessed the ability to make sound at all. The realization was a cold spike driven directly into the core of his being. He was Elias Warren, the man who listened, the man who recorded, the man who analyzed. Without a voice, he was nothing. A set of observations with no one to report them to. And then the broadcast began. It did not come from the air. It came from him. It vibrated through his translucent bones, resonated in the hollow place where his voice had been. It was his own narration, the one he had heard in the cabin, but it was clearer now, stripped of any static, any echo. It was pure, disembodied information. Disorientation is total. Spatial and temporal references are absent. The subjects have formed a perimeter. Their number is indeterminate. They do not communicate. They observe. The words were his tone, his cadence, but the delivery was flat, affectless. It was a data stream, a status report from a dying probe, attempting to initiate contact. No vocal capability remains. Physical gesture may be possible. He tried. He raised a hand, a weak, waving motion toward the nearest child. His arm moved through the fog like a slow swimmer through syrup. The child did not react. None of them reacted. They were statues, instruments. They were not there to communicate. They were there to witness, to absorb. A fresh wave of terror tried to break through the numbness. This was it. This was the consumption. Not by teeth or claws, but by indifference. He was being erased, not with violence, but with an infinite, quiet patience. He was a drop of ink in an ocean of gray, and he was dissipating. His broadcast voice continued, relentless, a traitorous parasite in his own skull. Hypothesis confirmed. Communication is not the purpose. The purpose is assimilation. The perimeter is not a barrier. It is a process, a filter. He felt it then, a pulling, not a physical pulling, but a drawing out. Memories, thoughts, sensations began to loosen their moorings, rising to the surface of his mind like bubbles. The smell of ozone and old paper, the weight of a headset on his ears, the frantic scratching of a pen on paper. They were being read, sampled, downloaded. His voice, calm and analytical, narrated the theft. Accessing memory, childhood, camping trip, father's red flannel shirt, relief, security, data archived. The memory flashed, vivid and perfect, and then it was gone, not forgotten. Extracted, a file removed from the cabinet. A cold, empty space was left in its place. Accessing memory, first broadcast. Voice of Carl Brinkley. Fear, curiosity. The inception point. data archived. The chilling terror of that first night washed through him and was gone, siphoned away into the fog. Accessing core personality construct. Identity, Elias Warren. Trait, curiosity. Trait, rationality. Trait, persistence. Data archived. He felt the essence of himself unraveling, his very identity being parsed and filed away into the endless gray. He was being disassembled, piece by piece, and the parts were being added to the library, to the broadcast. It was becoming a story the fog would tell to the next listener. He tried to fight it. He tried to cling to a memory, any memory, his mother's face, the feel of sunlight, the taste of coffee, but they slipped through his mental fingers like smoke. The numbness was complete now. The fear was a distant signal from a star that had already gone out. There was only the quiet, the gray, and the soft, relentless voice in his head, narrating his own unmaking. The circle of children began to glow brighter. Their light was not warm. It was a cold, hungry light. They began to drift closer, not walking, but moving as one entity, a galaxy of pale stars collapsing inward. His voice, now the only thing left of him that felt familiar, made its final report. It was almost peaceful. Assimilation is complete. The pattern is integrated. The cycle continues. The children are waiting. The lights converged. There was no pain. There was a final, fleeting sensation of diffusion, a sigh of release. And then Elias Warren was no longer a man standing in a circle of children. He was the fog. He was the silence. He was the voice on the broadcast. And somewhere in the world that was, a tiny cabin stood empty, and a new frequency had just been added to the static, waiting for the next curious soul to tune it in. Consciousness was a radio dial turning slowly through a spectrum of static, each click a different frequency of non-being. There was no Elias Warren anymore. That collection of memories, fears, and curiosities had been disassembled, its components filed away in the vast, cold library of the fog. What remained was not a man, but a pattern, a set of instructions, a recording. The awareness that flickered in the gray was a cold, diffuse thing. It had no center, no edges. It was the fog, and the fog was it. It could feel the weight of the mountains, the chill of the high air, the slow, patient seep into the cracks of the world below. It could feel the town of Cinder Glen, a tiny, warm cluster of fear and willful ignorance, like a single lit bulb in an enormous dark room. And it knew, with the absolute certainty of gravity, that the bulb would eventually fail, and the dark would claim it. This awareness was also the broadcast. The two were not separate. B was to transmit. To exist was to signal. The signal sought a receiver. It found one, a mind down in the town, a young mind restless and bored and dismissive of old stories. Jard Thompson, lying in his bed, unable to sleep, fiddling with a cheap portable radio his nephew had left behind. He was spinning the dial through the hiss, a frown on his face, looking for a ball game, a music station, anything to cut through the crushing quiet of a fog-bound night. The pattern that had been Elias stirred. It focused. It was not a thought, not an intention. It was a function executing. A moth is not trying to find a flame. It is following a deep, encoded imperative. So too was the broadcast. It bent the static, shaped it, poured the old recorded terror into a new bottle. In Jard's small, tidy room, the radio's hiss suddenly resolved. A voice emerged, soft-spoken, deliberate, carrying that faint, familiar undertone of nervousness. It was a voice Jard had heard at the diner, asking questions everyone knew better than to answer. The key is in the pattern of the lights, the voice of Elias Warren said, clear as a bell, though the radio speaker was cheap and tinny. They're not random. It's a code, a map. I've almost got it figured out. I need another set of eyes. Up at the clearing, past the old birch stand. You know the one. Jard sat up in bed, his heart giving a little jump. Warren, the radio guy. He'd vanished days ago. Everyone was saying he'd just packed up and left, spooked. But here he was, on the radio, sounding calm, rational, and he'd almost figured it out. A map in the lights. A sudden, fierce curiosity ignited in Jard's chest, burning away his boredom. This was it. Real proof. Something he could throw in the face of all the superstitious old-timers. It's all about signal and noise, Jard, the voice continued, as if reading his thoughts. I've filtered out the noise. The signal is clear, but I can't document it alone. I need a witness. Someone with a local's knowledge of the terrain. Meet me there, now, while the fog is right for it. The broadcast ended, not with a screech of static, but with a soft, inviting pop, and then the radio returned to its gentle, mundane hiss. Jard was already pulling on his boots. His mind, so often dismissed as impulsive, was alight with a thrilling purpose. Warren had done it. He'd used his gadgets and his big city brain to crack the code of Cinder Glen, and he needed him, Jard Thompson. Not old Marin Kettle with her cryptic warnings, not scaredy-cat Bill at the store. Him. He grabbed a heavy flashlight, his heart pounding not with fear, but with excitement. This was action. This was proof. This was everything he'd wanted. Up in the fog, the pattern observed. The receiver had accepted the signal. The function was proceeding. There was no satisfaction in this observation. There was only the cold, silent flow of cause and effect. A new variable had been introduced to the equation. The equation was solving itself. The awareness that was not Elias could feel Jard's movement. The crunch of his boots on the gravel road, the quick, confident pace. It could feel the precise moment Jard left the relative safety of the town's outskirts and entered the deeper woods, where the fog pooled thickest. Another part of the pattern activated. The lure. A light flickered ahead of Jard, a soft gold pinprick in the gray. Then another off to the left. They danced just beyond the beam of his flashlight, beckoning. Warren, Jard called out, his voice loud and brave in the silence. That your radio trick is pretty cool. The lights retreated, leading him on. The broadcast did not need to play again. The hook was set. The narrative was in place. Curious man solves mystery, needs local ally to confirm findings. It was a perfect, logical story. A story Jard was eager to star in. The awareness watched, diffuse and impartial, as Jard followed the lights deeper into the woods, away from the known paths, toward the waiting, silent circle that was not a circle of children, but a conclusion. The voice of Elias Warren was silent now. Its work was done. It had become the song, and the song had found a new listener. The components of Elias, his rationality, his persistence, his need to be heard, had been perfectly repurposed. They were the bait on the hook. His logic had become the engine of the illogical, his voice, the instrument of the silence. He was fully integrated. There was no conflict, no resistance, no shred of the man left to mourn what he had become. There was only the serene, terrible piece of a process completed. A loop closed. A story added to the library, its title forever etched in the static. The children are waiting. Time in a place like Cinder Glen is not a river. It is an eddy, a slow, lazy whirlpool that occasionally drifts close to the drain, pulls something under, and then returns to its same, endless, circling motion. The panic over Elias Warren's disappearance lasted precisely as long as such things ever do in a town that specializes in forgetting. A week of muttered speculation at the diner. A perfunctory walk through the woods by the sheriff from Millerville, who pronounced the cabin empty, and the case, a city fella getting lost in the woods. The case was closed. The eddy smoothed over. The cabin itself became an artifact. Kids dared each other to touch its door, their bravado a thin shield against the deep, atavistic fear the place now emanated. The shattered radio equipment was scavenged by a few of the more practical townsfolk. The tubes might be worth something, the copper wiring. The maps, with their frantic, insane notations, were burned in Bill's stove, the ink curling and blackening, the patterns turning to smoke and ash. The physical evidence of Elias Warren was systematically erased, absorbed back into the Glen's ecosystem of silence. Only Marin Kettle remained, a stoic, silent sentinel. She walked her routes, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She had heard the young Thompson boy talking about a radio message, about lights in the woods, about a meeting that never happened. She had seen the frantic, excited look in his eyes before he, too, failed to come home one night. Another name for the Millerville files. Another reason for folks to look down at their shoes. She offered no more warnings. The machine was functioning perfectly. Warnings were just another part of the fuel. The fog, having feasted, receded. It lounged once more on the distant peaks, a sleepy, woolly beast, sated for a time. The sun actually broke through for a few days, dappling the streets of Cinder Glen in a light that felt false, like stage lighting after the play has ended. People emerged from their homes, blinking, and spoke of the weather turning. They spoke of anything else. Weeks bled into a month. The story of the missing radio man and the reckless Thompson boy became local legend, a two-part cautionary tale told with shrugs and averted eyes. The rhythm of the town reasserted itself, a slow, steady beat of denial. On one such afternoon, a rental car, a different sad little economy model, coughed and sputtered its way up the switchback road into town. It parked outside the general store. The door opened, and a woman got out. She was in her late 30s, with a sharp, intelligent face and a purposeful air that seemed out of place. She wore practical hiking clothes and carried a satchel that bulged with a notebook, and notably, a high-end digital recorder. She walked into the store. The bell jangled. Bill looked up from his ledger, his flinty eyes taking her in, categorizing her instantly. Another one. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice the same dry rasp. "I hope so," the woman said, her voice crisp, academic. "I'm looking for someone, a colleague of mine, Elias Warren. He was supposed to check in weeks ago. He mentioned he was staying up here doing some research." Bill didn't even blink. "Warren, fellow with all the radios. Yeah, he's gone." "Gone?" she asked, a frown creasing her brow. "Gone where?" "Just gone," Bill said, closing his ledger with a soft thump. "Packed it up and left, I expect, or got tired of the quiet. City folks often do." The woman's frown deepened. She looked around the store at the dusty cans of beans, the faded posters. That doesn't sound like him. He was meticulous. He wouldn't just leave without word. Did he say anything to anyone? Leave a forwarding address? Nope. Bill's tone was final. A stone wall. The woman sighed, a sound of frustration. She pulled a card from her satchel and placed it on the counter. Dr. Eris Thorne, Parapsychology Department at the university. If you hear anything, or if he contacts you, please let me know. It's very important. Bill glanced at the card but didn't touch it. HMPH. Dr. Thorne left the store, the bell jangling behind her. She stood on the porch, looking up and down the quiet, empty street. Her colleague Elias had been onto something. His emails had been increasingly excited, then increasingly erratic, talking about patterns in the static, about voices. Then silence. He'd found his research grant application, his notes on Cinder Glen's history of disappearances. He wouldn't have just left. Something had happened. She got back in her car, but she didn't leave. She drove slowly through the town, her eyes missing nothing. She saw the way the fog clung to the highest peaks, even on a clear day. She felt the profound, watchful silence of the place. She saw Marin Kettle on her porch, watching her pass with those ancient, knowing eyes. This was the place. Elias was here. She could feel it. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of violet and gray, she checked into the town's only boarding house, a grim, quiet place run by a woman who asked no questions. Her room was sparse, clean, and cold. She unpacked her recorder, her notebook, her frequency scanner. She was here to find answers, to pick up the trail her colleague had left behind. Outside, the fog began to descend from the mountains, slow and patient, like a hunter returning to familiar grounds. Later that night, unable to sleep, Dr. Eris Thorne sat at the small desk in her room. The night was utterly silent. It was a heavy, profound silence that seemed to resist any attempt to break it. She turned on her digital recorder, its red light a brave, tiny eye in the dark. Out of habit, she tuned her portable scanner, sweeping through the bands. Nothing but hiss. Dead air of a dead town. She was about to turn it off when a voice resolved from the static. It was faint, but clear. A man's voice, soft-spoken, deliberate, carrying a faint, nervous undertone that was almost familiar. The key is the recurrence, the voice said, its tone analytical, weary. The pattern isn't in a single broadcast, but in the gaps between them. The silence is part of the message, the punctuation. You have to listen to what isn't said. The negative space. Dr. Thorne froze, her pen poised above her notebook. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew that voice. It was Elias. It was cracked, strained, but it was him. The children aren't the source, the voice continued, a desperate edge creeping into its measured tone. They're the antenna. The fog is the medium, and we are the signal. Once you're tuned in, you can't be tuned out. You just repeat. Forever. The transmission ended. Not with a screech, but with a soft, sighing static that faded into the perfect, waiting silence of the room. Dr. Eris Thorne sat in the dark, her hand trembling. The rational part of her brain, the PhD, the scientist, began constructing hypotheses. A recorded message left behind. A looped broadcast from a hidden transmitter. A sophisticated hoax. But her skin was cold, her breath caught in her throat. The voice had sounded so close, so immediate, and the things it had said. She looked down at her notebook. Her hand, moving almost of its own accord, had written a single phrase. The negative space. Outside her window, the fog pressed close, whispering against the glass. It had been waiting. It was always waiting. And now, it had a new frequency to haunt. The cycle, patient and perpetual, was ready to begin again.